sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the story of Jamaica has a ton to do with the production of sugar. As Liam has just told us, first the British got a hold of Barbados, but Barbados was just a little too small, and needed more sugar. Once you get a little bit of sugar, you want a lot more sugar. So they got a hold of a larger island. Jamaica's a pretty decently sized island for the Caribbean and the Greater Antilles, as we looked about on the map. And this is a massive, a huge and massive production of sugar, and it becomes something. Mintz here says that that it becomes essential to basically to the diets of the working class. We talked about this a little bit in the last class, that and this is on page 46, costly at first, but versatile, preservable, and for nearly every consumer delicious, sucrose was an ideal commodity of modernity in late 17th century Europe. As they grew plentiful and cheap, sugar, tobacco, and stimulant beverages became important symbols of rising capitalist practice and were the first desirable transoceanic commodities ever to be sold to masses of consumers. Newly marketed soft drugs such as cocoa, coffee, and tea became the constant companions of sugar. By the way, Liam, what's wrong with coffee and tea? Why do you need sugar for it? Yeah, and it gives you a lot more calories if you have the sugar. Interestingly, in the places where coffee and tea were first cultivated, and cacao as well, in the Americas, they didn't use sugar or sweeteners. They were strong there. They just had them. But boy, oh boy, that changes with the English and the French and the Europeans. They just started adding a ton of sugar in. To grow all that sugar cane, there was an unbelievably large, by unbelievably, I mean just the scale of this is hard to imagine, of how many people were put onto some of these islands. As Mintz put it, the island of Jamaica, it's a bigger island than Barbados, but it's not that big. And they probably imported about 1 million Africans, which is basically almost twice as much as the entire North America and the entire United States in one island. Same thing with Saint-Domingue, Haiti, about 1 million. And so the scale of this is enormous, and most Africans were brought to the New World to plant and cut sugar cane. And so we have this massive importation, and we have some pretty strict social hierarchy that develops. There's intermixture, but the demographics of this are such that, that Mintzwood says, that there are no enslaved persons that would be white, and there are also no planters that would be black. There would be some planters who would be called colored or not non-white. But the hierarchy of race and the relationships between them were pretty legal and strictly enforced. And I'm putting that out there because as we're looking at Haiti and those sort of legal codes that developed under the French, I want to compare what happens with some of the mixed race populations in Haiti and to the demographics of Puerto Rico as I said, we might not get very far into Puerto Rico, but just the basics demographics will at least get to that part. So we have this huge importation, this huge importation of enslaved Africans. We have enormous amounts of sugar production, which is the one thing they are wanting to do. But as we go along in this chapter, Mintz starts using a word which is a combination word which may have even invented. Starts talking about proto-peasants. And I guess I want to start here first with if you're planting your whole island in sugarcane, where do you get your food to eat from? This island, and the most profitable thing to do is plant in sugarcane. Where do you get your food? How do you feed people? Yeah, Amy. Yeah, a lot of times they would try to import it because it was less profitable to grow food there. You'd want to grow sugarcane and then buy your food. So there's a lot of things that were being imported. In the same way that we talked about Potosi and how much silver was there, sugarcane was like this hugely profitable thing. So you'd be importing all your stuff from outside. You wouldn't want to be trying to grow any food. And the plantation owners especially didn't want to be growing food, but they did start to allow something. Who started growing food? Huh? The enslaved Africans started letting them have their little, what were at first small garden plots. And as they would be able to work those on their so-called days off, a day off a week, and then they would be able to sell it. And so Mintz says that this is what happened. And I'm glad I'm glad Felicia talked about that with the enslaved people, is that so peasants is basically a word that means a small scale farmer, right? So a small scale farmer. And in this case, the reason Mintz is using the word proto-peasants is that they began as, technically enslaved people. They were fully owned, but they got this little bit of their own plots to work and were able to then have control over their own merchandise. And so they started to begin looking more like small farmers within being enslaved. Alicia, you had a quote from us on page 74 that says, what does he think about these peasants? Or where do we usually use the word peasants for, I guess I would say. When we usually talk about peasants, at least. Huh? Well, we're usually talking about, peasants are usually something. Liam, where are we talking about peasants in? Yeah, it's usually like, old Europe, the peasants and the lord. Sometimes Europeans will come over here and go to some small farm and say, oh, look at the peasants. No peasants here. Nobody wants to be called a peasant here, or they want to be a farmer or something. But, peasants basically mean small farmer. And what Mintz is saying is he says that, and this is where Felicia was quoting from page 74, Caribbean peasants are quite unlike other peasants elsewhere, European or Asian peasants, or even Latin American peasants. They are often people of largely African origin whose ancestors were kept in slavery. So usually when we think about peasants, we're thinking about medieval times and sort of, my dad was a peasant and my like going back in time to time immemorial. What Mintz is saying is this is a really interesting case where people became small scale farmers, even though they began as enslaved and working on plantations. They developed this system. They wanted economic independence. And their zeal to buy even tiny bits of land. So here they are. I mean, here they've been enslaved, but you got that little bit of, being able to grow things. So as soon as they did that, the schooling they sought for their children, their cultivation of the land, and their marketing of its products, the newly free demonstrated their basic desire for economic independence. And so that is a huge driver of how things would go in Jamaica, was the idea that you needed to be independent. And for me, I just love this quote from page 71, which is something that you only actually get from doing field work with, perhaps literally field work, being in the field with other people, and how people think about their lives. And so, as Mintz said, the people he was with thought of farming as life itself rather than primarily as work. That's what it meant to be alive, was to have a little bit of land and be able to farm it. So if you're thinking that it might seem a little unusual, but that's what the kind of insight you got from them. Did this work, Amy? Yeah, it actually worked a ton. They were producing a ton of food. They were basically producing all the food for the island. They became, in some ways, in many ways, a threat to the predominant interests. So for the government, both the pre-independence and post-independence government, I guess the best thing that the government did for them was just to let them be. Certainly for some of the people who were the first small farmers here, yeah, I mean, they weren't able to become educated, but they certainly would have wanted their children to become educated. And what Mintz is saying is here that the government, the Caribbean government, they never cared about really sort of utilizing that basic human resource, that providing roads, infrastructure, education to their population, and building upon those successes was not something that they wanted to do. So at best, they just ignored them and didn't provide them anything at all. But at worst, they were threatening, trying to take their land and trying to have legal restrictions, or trying to make a law that you had to work a certain amount for a plantation, or had to try to get them to work for minimum wage. There are all sorts of threats, and Mintz says that they've developed something that to an outsider might look like paranoia, but it's not, because if you're always being actually threatened, then some of those threats are real. So they're very suspicious about other things. And then, of course, one of the other ways that they tried to break the peasants and make sure that they were kept in line was, as Marcus told us, they import indentured labor, as much labor as they could, from India and from China. And so you got on various Caribbean islands. Cuba did this. Other Caribbean islands as well, you tried to import other laborers. Oh, actually, even probably, there's little known to many of us, but in the United States, in Mississippi, they actually also imported a few thousand Chinese laborers to work the plantations in Mississippi after the end of slavery. So there's a population in Mississippi called the Mississippi Chinese, who were brought to for exactly the same reason. So that was one of the ways in which people tried to sort of break the back of this. So as a result, there's a legacy here of a term that Mintz doesn't use, but I'm going to try and use a little bit later, it's a form of racism, but perhaps better known as colorism, this kind of explicit attention to color and all these gets mixed in with other hierarchies such as social class, gender, and those kinds of things. So we end up with an interesting society which has this massive African demographic influence, but also has a planter class, and also India and people from other places being brought in and contributing to a very dynamic but a very highly unequal society. All right. I'll talk here because Mintz is talking about, these hierarchies of color and class and how that relates to ideas about race. And in the Americas, in Latin America and in the United States and in the Caribbean is really where we see the modern invention of the idea of race. And so to start us off, just want to talk about skin color and what we see when we go around the world. Probably showed this to you in some intro to anthropology class if you've seen this, something like this before. Skin color is something that the anthropologists and the biologists call it, has clinal distribution. What that means is that it varies gradually along a geographic gradient. Basically, almost all the cool stuff of human evolution happens within Africa. As people expanded out of Africa into Eurasia, into some of these northern climates, there was some depigmentation that happened, probably in order to capture vitamin D. And as people went into the Americas, there was some similar depigmentation and probably repigmentation. And basically, if you looked at the skin color distribution along the world in around 1492, so before people started sailing across the ocean and meeting each other oceanically, if you walked from the north down to the south, what you would see is gradual skin color variation. In each town or village or river, you'd cross it, and the people might be a little bit darker or a little bit lighter than the other side. And this is basically because of sunlight capture and the gradient lines of needing sun protection, but also vitamin D absorption. And over time, this developed into various places that were darker or lighter than others. But there was never a line at which you'd cross and be like, aha, I've crossed from the whites to the blacks. It was all gradual. And it was gradual east to west as well. There was never a line where you'd be like, aha, I'm now between the whites and the Asians. And here I'm crossing Uzbekistan, and all of a sudden the people have turned Asian. No, all the features varied gradually. If you compared people in one latitude and put them together with people in another latitude, you'd say, oh, wow, yeah, different. But if you compare people next to each other, it was always gradual variation. By the way, this happened within places as well. So something that a lot of people don't know, but within India itself, just within this very part of South Asia, there's a large variation between people who are very light-skinned and people who are very dark-skinned. Some of it is geographical, and some of it, obviously, people move around too. But there's a large variation within a lot of these populations as well. And same thing within North and South America. What happens under colonialism is that as people from some regions of the world sailed over and then brought in people from other regions of the world, dragged in, as Mintz put it. You had people meeting up together from very different places, right? And so you had people working in the same environments, in new environments in the Caribbean and in places like Brazil and in North America, where all of a sudden you had people that, it's not that people didn't move around, people have always moved around, but they wouldn't have been transoceanically transported so that they were outside of their original geographic area. And so you had a lot more speculation on, the idea of, it's not that people didn't look at each other and think about physical differences. People had always done that. But the idea that people were grouped together into these blocks of people that might be called Black or might be called white or might be called Asian. And in fact, if you think about it, one of the reasons why South Asia and being from India is kind of left out of many, especially North American race classifications, North Americans often get confused, is because they were left out of this colonial encounter, at least at first. And so that doesn't come in until some of the later importations. And so our ideas about race come from, are amplified by this colonial encounter. And so race becomes an explanation for why people are different from each other, but it also becomes a justification for who was supposed to be in control or ruling and who were supposed to be ruled or working on the plantations. Now, if you've taken any anthropology, what is anthropology going to tell us about these racial classifications? Yes, that race is a social construction. And we have biological difference, but the way that we classify that is social. Now, you didn't say that at first because, it's kind of a mantra. What does that mean? Sometimes it's difficult to, if you just say race is a social construction, sometimes it messes people up. What that means is that, yes, there are real biological differences in the human population. There is variation in skin tone and bones and all kinds of things. But you can't group that up into concordant, separate biological races the way that we think we can. And so the way that we classify people is actually based on our social ideas about where people belong. And I'll just say that the differences between how Latin America, people classify different people in Latin America and the Caribbean versus the way we do in the United States is often taken as a revelation that, like, aha, yes, in fact, in different places, there are different social classifications for race. So there's two parts of this, though, and I just want to put this from the beginning. Oftentimes when we say, aha, gender is a social construction or race is a social construction, people are like, oh, it's all in your head then, it isn't real. And I'm just going to say that when we say something is a social construction, that means it is very real. It means it's risen to the level of a huge amount of reality and is going to affect life outcomes. It's just like money. Money is a social construction. Don't do it again. See, you knew what I was about to do. I'm about to start ripping some money up because it's just pieces of paper, but we believe it and we can turn it into things like food and candy and drugs. And then all of a sudden it's good, right? And having more of it makes me happier, makes me better educated and makes me better healthier. And if I rip up too much of my money, I'm not going to be able to buy all those yummy things. Right? So yes, it's a social construction, which is only there because we believe it, but it has real outcomes. Thanks. All right, so how do we do race in the United States? This is Halle Berry. We won the Oscar for Best Actress in a Leading Role in 2002. Now people win Best Actress Oscars every year. Why was this a big year? First African-American or Black female actress to win an Oscar for Best Actress. You know, there's various categories. There might have been somebody that won something else, but yeah, first Best Actress in a leading role. I mean, is there anybody who was born before 2002? Close to 2002? Around there, around when you were born, right? Around, close. How many more Black female Best Actresses have been since you were born in 2002, since Halle Berry? You would imagine more, you would hope for more, but the answer is none. Yeah, I know. In terms of Black female Best Actresses. So she looks back on this and says she's sad about it. It makes her unhappy because she thought there was going to be more. There haven't been. Yeah, I think this was a film called Monsters Ball. Pretty sure, which is an interesting movie about race in the US South. If I remember correctly. It's been a long time, see? Yeah. Anyway, Liam, how do we know she's Black? Paid your best judgment. See, how do we know people are Black in this country? Just the way they look. We believe in this country that the way we determine race is by skin color, right? Liam was peering at that. That's why we dimmed the light so we could see the skin color. Who's that? This is the post-Oscar party. No, I'm going to tell you that's her biological mother, who identifies as white. And that's who she was basically raised by. How is it in the United States of America that you can be of a different race than your own biological mother? Yes, there is, Liam, you're correct. There is a Black biological father who is not present in this picture and was not present, I think, in her upbringing. You are correct. Now, I need somebody like Liam to bounce things off of because he's unafraid, and that's important to be in this world. If not, you know, it's often if I don't have a Liam around, it gets very sad and boring for me. We all owe Liam many favors. Yes, there is obviously something going on biologically here, but it is interesting, right, that in America, it's not weird that that one person is called white and one person is called Black, even though they are mother-daughter. I'm not talking about adopted. I'm talking about had this child, right? I mean, isn't that weird? I think it's weird. You should think it's weird, but maybe you don't because we live in this country. We actually believe that we look at skin color, right? That's what we believe we do. But we don't really do skin color. I'll tell you about some places that do skin color, and they look at people's skin and they tell you, oh yeah, you look like, as Mintz will put it later on in Puerto Rico, trigueño, wheat colored, right? They have all these terms for different colors of skin. In the United States, we have ideas about your descent and your blood and how it mixes and how people are classified according to cultural rules. So what are those rules? All these puzzles for Liam. Let's not torture him much longer. So in the United States, we usually have rigid distinctions between what we classify people as. As I said, we classify Halle Berry as Black or African-American and her mother as white. And that's been the traditional polarity of the United States, is people that are either white or Black. And if people seem to be somewhat in between, we get confused in the United States, or we say, when we look at them and we ask, well, what are you? Because we have a pretty strong white-black polarity, and it tends to be. By the way, these are general statements. These are not, you shouldn't think of these as absolute rules, and there's local variations and historical variations, but as a general rule, there's a white-black polarity. And in most cases, when people, I have to put a lot of things in quotes because, you know, nobody's pure. We're all mixed up anyway. But if you have a classification in the United States that when there is a mixing, like with Halle Berry, we follow rules that are technically called in anthropology hypodescent, which is the child of a mixed race union gets the category that is less socially desirable. So if you're a white person and a black person, those children are classified as black. If, you know, and again, we're using terms from back in the day. If you were white and indigenous or Native American or Indian, you would have been classified as continuing to be Indian. And in some US states, they would classify this by fractions. So if you're a quarter black, you're black, or if you're a 16th black, so if any of your grandparents or grandparents, but in some places they just said, you have any African ancestry, the one drop rule, then you are classified as African. And as I'm referring here, this was, and well, I guess many of these laws, thankfully, have the legal status has gone away, but laws about who you could marry, who was legitimate offspring, who could live where, what place in the bus you needed to be. These were laws, you know, race was enforced by the legal landscape and by people in their everyday life as well. So this is basically how we do race in the United States. In Latin America and in the Caribbean, many of the countries, not all, and again, as a general rule, race is sometimes seen as being more negotiable. And that's something we'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the reasons that people kind of maneuver within race is that there are multiple categories. So the idea that there is only 2 categories or 3 categories for race would not be what you'd be thinking about. We'll talk about some of that. And if there is a mixture, people can raise their status. And that's why, you know, when we read this paragraph about the person who didn't want their light-skinned daughter to marry a darker-skinned man, because then the children, you're trying to get up the world, get into what we call hyperdescent. There were many laws passed in Latin American and Caribbean countries, but the practices, they were often much more difficult to enforce than in the United States. So in practice, there was a lot of mixture and a lot of race mixing going on. I think we're still okay. So there's a number of reasons why race seems more fluid in Latin America or negotiable. One of them we talked about is that there are intermediate categories. And some of these derive from what are called casta paintings. And so they'd make these 16 blocks of where they'd portray various mixtures. And so in some of our books, I think already in Restall and Lane, they've used the term mestizo or mestiza or mestizaje, which basically means mixed or mixing. But in many places in Latin America, if you had a offspring from an indigenous person or an Indian and a Spaniard, those offspring would be classified as a new category as mixed or as mestizo. And if you had a mixture between a black person and a Spaniard, that would be socially classified as mulatto. And then even, as you see here, there's like 16 different boxes. So sometimes they'd invent terms for other kinds of unions, like mixture between an indigenous person and a black person in some parts of Latin America was called Zombo, but that is probably a derogatory term. But the point is that in each of these things, there would be a term for the mixture and what it would create, and that those would become real categories on official documents or censuses. So the second thing about this is that you could, instead of, like in the United States, you usually would have these rules where people would be classified if you had a mix between white and black as black, but in Latin American and some Caribbean societies, if you had offspring that were Spanish and Indian, they would be classified as a mestiza. But then if you had another mix down the line, they'd become something else, which was a little bit higher category of castiza. And then if you had another mix down the line, you could kind of work your way back up to being Spanish again, being European. So you would be able to sort of climb the ladder here. So that's another reason why sometimes in Latin American Caribbean societies, it's seen as the role of hyperdescent. The third part of fluidity is that wealth and social class are often considered to be part of your skin color, which can change over your life. Well, let me start with places like Brazil and other places in Latin America and the Caribbean, where you might have all kinds of terms for how a person would actually look. So, in our world, we looked at Halle Berry and we said African American or black, whereas in Brazil they would actually look and say, well, slightly brown, or some sort of color term which would match their skin color. And so sometimes anthropologists have gone to Brazil and people will be like, you can change your race based on what you've been doing over your lifetime, if you've gotten darker or lighter over your lifetime. And some people would even say that they are a different race or a different skin color by season. There's also a very famous Brazilian phrase. They usually go like this when they say it: money whitens. And so one of my friends went to Brazil and did anthropology. Oh, Pele, our most beautiful soccer player, passed away last year. And say, what race is Pele? Brazilians would say, he's white. Like, what? Hey man, money whitens. So it was a very different way of doing race and of trying to figure out what race is. And so you can see perhaps why someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, when he goes into Jamaica, feels like he can now navigate and negotiate society in a way that he was unable to do in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't paying attention to race and color and hierarchy in Jamaica, but it might feel very different to him than the kinds of ways that he felt confined in the United States, so that he can feel like he can navigate the social scene in a different way.